Okay, so I was asked to talk today about, is this safe? Looking at my health and safety, about unlikely, unusual and productive partnerships in relation to research. So I wanted to say a little bit about the context and what the particular concerns have been in relation to my research. These unlikely, unusual and productive partnerships, the way that we might think about evaluating interventions, and I'm particularly looking at this issue about the relationship between research, impact, service delivery and policy change. And I guess my research is at the intersection of all of those and thinking about how best to conduct that research and evaluation at micro, meso, and possibly sometime in the future macro level, but at the moment at micro and meso level. So in terms of my research over the years, it's been particularly focused on adolescent recreational drug use. I've got a colleague here, a co-author here, Lisa Williams, that we were involved with a debate about normalisation, interested in issues around changing trends in drug use. Interestingly, I was co-editor of a book on binge drinking 20 years ago, and then next month I've got a book that I co-edited, which is looking at the decline in young adult consumption around the world. So I'm particularly interested in changing trends, and I'd say key issues relate to issues around gender, class, ethnicity, intersectionality, and issues around transgressive leisure in relation to things like festivals, licensed venues, nightclubs, bars, so on and so forth. And I guess like some of the previous speakers have said, interested particularly in policy-oriented research, in pragmatic research, in harm reduction. And I guess the bottom line for all of this is that probably all of the speakers today, that we hope and want to make a difference, that we're at the coalface in various ways. And for me, I would definitely describe my own research as action research. I've also been involved in policy, though. I was a government drugs advisor for 10 years on the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs. I've also was one of the founding members of David Nutt's Co-Science, Drug Science Committee. I've sat on Liberal Democrat, Conservative and Labour expert panels. And I set up an NGO with a colleague of mine in 2013 to deliver drug safety testing, as we call it, or drug checking in the UK. And it also set up in Australia, a sister organisation, last year. And we now have about 500 volunteers in the UK, the Loop, and we have about 150 or so in Australia. And the idea is that we are conducting research and evaluation, but we're also delivering a drug checking service in what is still a politically and legally and financially challenging area. And it's what I wanted to talk about today is about this public-private third sector multi-agency partnership that's resulted from that. I also do prison teaching. It's another job I didn't mention. Prison teaching. And I guess one of the themes or one of the questions for me is about how we can progress reform in what is potentially ambivalent or even hostile stakeholder environments where we might have resistance to any innovation that we might want to introduce. And for me as an academic, I think a keen appreciation about the fact that top-down policy change there are a lot of obstacles to that, and that what we find when we're in the policy domain is that the academic research might have less impact than things like the personal anecdote, the case study of one that somebody might bring into the room, and also what Alex Stevens called in his ethnography of the Cabinet Office, the killer chart, the killer graph, the killer chart, this idea that a civil servant might show one graph or one chart which supposedly nails a particular line of argument in terms of the direction of policy. For me, in terms of the killer chart, it's this one. And I guess this is a particular thing which has been motivating me over the last few years is, as we're all here today and know that we have the highest drug-related death rate on record and amongst the highest in Europe, and that we all want to be doing something differently in relation to this. And for me as a criminologist, part of this has been the role of policing in relation to this, and that the public health and the criminal justice are absolutely too entwined. And as in relation to that, in relation to this point in terms of policy, is we have a bit of a catch-22, I think, in that when do we have enough evidence to be able to introduce policy change? And sitting on ASIMD and seeing the discussion around foil, one of the things that was frustrating for me was the debate was around what is the evidence that this will reduce harm, and also conversely asking what is the evidence that it won't increase harm, and an idea that it could potentially drive people to use crack cocaine because they were going to be given free foil. and a demand, where is the evidence to prove that that isn't the case? And so seeing these convoluted debates play out in the policy domain, what you can see is a frustration really in relation to the fact that at what point do we have enough evidence that we can actually introduce some sort of an intervention, and conversely never asking where is the evidence that the deterrent value of criminal justice reduces drug-related harm, and in relation to drug safety testing or drug checking, where is the evidence of people consuming unknown substances that is going to reduce drug-related harm, and that isn't a driver. So I guess part of me setting up the NGO The Loop was that an understanding that academic research can and does fall on deaf ears in relation to policymakers. And to pick up on the point by Magdalena in this morning's lovely presentation about capacitating change, that it was set up as an action research project, as an impact case study, but also to be piloting this, to really jump into this catch-22 loop of people saying, you can't set it up because we don't have the evidence base in the UK. Well, how do we get that if we don't set it up in the UK? A bit of double speak here, though, is because drug checking was seen as approval, condoning, facilitating, is we had to call it something different. So we called it drug safety testing, or actually we used the term multi-agency safety testing. So we prefigured this idea of the multi-agency partnership in the conceptualisation of our delivery of drug checking. And in relation to the role of stakeholders, we drew them in terms of how we might talk about tilting policy away from the zero tolerance that Adam was talking about, and towards doing things differently. And we borrowed the language of counter-terrorism, and we reformulated that in terms of drug policy at festivals and talked about the 3 Ps. And we managed to get stakeholder buy-in to the 3 Ps. So before 2016, all festivals had an official zero tolerance of drugs policy. And we would have festivals say to us, we would love to introduce drug checking, but we can't because we have a zero tolerance of drug policy. So we had to get around that. And so the 3 Ps are from counter-terrorism are, first of all, you prevent drugs getting on site. That's the first P. The second P is that you pursue drug dealers on site, accepting that that's what the police and security services will want to do, particularly in relation to things like violence and weapons. But the third P is to protect the general public. And within that realm of the third P, we were able to then negotiate that we could have drug checking on site under the umbrella of that third P. And so in some ways it was a policy doublespeak, but in some ways it helped allow and facilitate the stakeholders to take a step forward, which some of them wanted to take. But for me, this was an action research project, so it's very much tying in the research with the service delivery and it collecting data in relation to that. So collecting data in relation to evaluating the service and accepting that although it's been going for 50 years around the world, it is still relatively embryonic in terms of its evidence base. And definitely not enough yet to have swayed some of the key policymakers in the UK. So one of the things that I've been interested in is using this micro, meso, macro analysis of conceptualising the social structures in relation to moving then from practice to evidence, since we can't be moving from evidence to practice, and building on some work by Sharon and colleagues in relation to the evaluation of large, complex and messy evaluations. So drug checking's been going for a long time, nearly 50 years, if you include California, where they had LSD acid rescue teams and they were testing for heroin. In Europe, though, it really bedded in from the late 80s with the whole rise of acid house and rave. And then we saw it from the Netherlands to Belgium to Italy to Spain to Portugal. It spread all around Europe. And finally, after some time lag, into the UK. But this wasn't out of the blue. This was actually, I would say, an evolution and came about because already we had various partnerships in the background. So I was shadowing Home Office scientists. I was also shadowing a commercial lab, and they're all testing behind the scenes for evidential and intelligence purposes. And I think that was important because they already had the lab on site and could already be seen by stakeholders having the value of a lab on site. And then we bumped that debate a little bit further along and said, hey, why don't we be doing this not just for intelligence and evidence purposes, but for harm reduction purposes? We can test things in medical incidents and medical emergencies. And that was agreed, and so we introduced that in 2013 in nightclubs and festivals. And then once we've done that, we could say, hey, why don't we let the public bring their samples too? We've got these labs on site. The only people who aren't being allowed to bring samples are the public. We let all the other agencies. And so it felt in a way like a natural progression, and it wasn't just plucked out of thin air. So we tested 2 festivals for the public in 2016, 3 in 2017, and 7 in 2018. I'm sure lots of people have already seen the media coverage, so I won't spend too long on what we actually do. But suffice to say, we have a pretty large lab. We'll have anything up to 35 chemists in the lab on site, and a sample will go along a production line of testing. People will come and get a raffle ticket. We ask them to go away, come back about an hour later. We photograph, we weigh, we catalogue the samples. We then will use Fourier transfer infrared spectroscopy, which almost like a triage, to very quickly, in a couple of minutes, identify the main ingredients. We'll remove the dye, the filler from the substance. We will then be quantifying using ultraviolet spectroscopy or mass loss analysis, because in relation to the strength of substances at the moment circulating in the UK, as you will all be familiar with, is purity is a real issue, dosage is a real issue. So we need to know the strength and not just the contents of what we're dealing with. We do have fentanyl strips testing for opiates, but we have virtually no opiate samples submitted, and we've never had a positive test for that. And we're also trialling mass spectroscopy with Durham University Chemistry Department. So there are developments underway in terms of making the equipment better, stronger, cheaper, more happy to be transported to festivals, because generally chemistry equipment doesn't like going to festivals. I should admit that in the early days of my research, I didn't particularly like going to festivals either. It seemed to be a bit of a race to the bottom in terms of physical exhaustion and personal hygiene. But I've grown to love them now. It's also to be saying, why introduce this at festivals? Well, I think there's quite a few things to unpick, which I don't have a lot of time, but to flag up a couple of points. Firstly, festivals are big business. They're huge business in the UK. Depending on how you define festivals, there's anything up to 700 or even 900, depending on the definition you use, of festivals. Somewhere between 7 and 10 million people go to festivals every year. Our average size festival is 25 to 75,000. Glastonbury's 250,000. All the tickets sold out in half an hour for Glastonbury. I've never actually managed to get a ticket for Glastonbury. It's always sold out. So these are big business, huge numbers of people in a tiny space, intent on the weekend of excess that Adam was portraying. But also there is a huge chance of drug experiences going wrong, of medical incidents, of hospital admissions, and also drug-related deaths. And our festival drug-related death rate is increasing. I can't show you the figures for that because we don't know, because festivals are very good at keeping a lid on what's happening at their festival. You will see announcements of drug-related deaths, deaths at festivals, which will only become apparent that there were drug-related deaths a year later in the coroner's, in the inquest. But nevertheless, the rate is increasing. We had 5 drug-related deaths at Bank Holiday weekend that were all due to high-strength pills. So particular concerns about this licensed leisure arena. And so festivals are concerned, drug-related death could lead to them having a licensing review, they could lead to them losing their licence, so their whole commercial business could depend on this. Equally, they don't want to be seen as having a drug-related problem, and therefore they're in this ambivalent position that they want to do everything possible to reduce drug-related deaths, but they don't necessarily want it to be known that this is happening on site because they don't want to be seen as having a drug-related problem, which in itself might lead to a licensing review. So this is the sort of complexity of negotiations when working with the private sector in relation to this. Coming into this 10 years ago, though, we started doing annual festival surveys. So we've got 10 years of data that we're writing up at the moment. And for me, this, in terms of the research, led directly on from my work in the previous couple of decades, which was looking at licensed leisure in terms of alcohol and drug use in pubs, in dance clubs, and in normal high street nightclubs. Interested in monitoring trends and also why people are taking drugs and what the consequence of that is. So the Loop was developed as an action research project. We have a team of chemists, we have the team of healthcare staff who deliver the results. We also have a team of researchers in our research work stream. And so we have about 50 volunteers who are involved with this data collection, and that crosses all disciplines, particularly obviously public health, chemistry, sociology, criminology, and so forth. We are also particularly interested in how we can better evaluate this service in what I said is an embryonic evidence base. But in relation to what's happening at the festivals, these surveys are portraying this picture of atypical intoxication. Generally, drug use is higher at festivals around Europe than it is in people's everyday lives. They're away from the constraints of work, of home, of family. And in the UK, that could be for 4 days or more. In our research, we found that on average, half of people who go to UK festivals take drugs. And half of those say that they take larger quantities than they do when they usually take drugs. And a quarter of those say they take a wider range of drugs. So they're taking more drugs, taking larger quantities, and they're taking a wider range of drugs. Half of drug users are taking 2 or more drugs, so we've got to look at synergies between different drugs. And the British are drinking on top of all of this. So over 9 in 10 are also drinking as well as being polydrug users. And for those of you who will be familiar with festivals, you'll know that people will act out of their everyday experiences. So it's quite usual, for example, for people to say that they'll have lager for breakfast, which they would never do at home. The sorts of consumption patterns are absolutely out of their norm. But interesting for us is 1 in 12 people at festivals only take drugs at festivals now. So we've got a particular interest in that group and the additional risk for them. So they're taking more drugs, they're having longer drug taking sessions, mixing all these different drugs together. But from our point of view, it's an opportunity then. It's an opportunity for them in terms of access, but it's also an opportunity for us in terms of being able to access that drug using group in the particular drug using space. So we say it's time for them, time to test, but also time to talk as well across that 4 or 5 days. So in terms of the partnerships involved with this then, I think the first unlikely one for us is the police. And probably we didn't expect this at the start, that the police have been the most supportive for us in terms of our introduction of drug checking. And they've been at the forefront of everything that we've done. We only go on site at the invitation of the police and with an MOU from the police. And I think in terms of unpicking this, it's really interesting, I think, what's happening in terms of the English police at the moment, driving harm reduction initiatives. So we can see something like Durham Checkpoint, Bristol, their drugs education project. And I think some of this has come from the fact that we've seen more than 20% cut to policing budgets, is there's a drive amongst the police to think about reconsidering how they use their resources. And I've got a quote here from Jason Koo from Thames Valley Police, when I asked him about his passionate support for police being involved in harm reduction, that policing is a privilege. It gives you a unique opportunity, a unique position in the community to drive social justice. Police-led local partnerships can make things happen. You can't hang around just talking about it. I've just dealt with too much death. And at the end of the day, it's the police who will knock on the door of the parents when those children have died. We've also had unusual support from even a Hollywood actor. We had a lot of support from the press. In fact, even the right-wing press has been supportive of this, and we've put a lot of time and effort into positive press coverage because we've wanted to demonstrate the professionalism of our service, of the chemists and of the healthcare staff. And it's also helped us then develop our relationship with other stakeholders in terms of this positive addressing of drug-related harm on site. And that it's shown that we can work and collaborate with the police to try and keep people safe. So that's been something that we've put considerable time and effort into. The other, I think, the unusual partnership is with parents. When I started doing drugs research, my boss said never share a platform with a grieving parent. And that has been totally turned on its head now with organisations like Anyone's Child, that there are amazing, passionate, articulate, bereaved parents who speak in this space now, who are so well informed, who can seg from the most tragic story to the most passionate plea for drug policy reform. Quite often I'll say, we're redundant now on these panels. They do such an amazing job. But they have, we work very closely with them now, and I work very closely with mothers who have lost daughters the same age as my daughter. And so it's a very close and very moving and unexpected partnership, fantastically, I think, productive, and has really changed the political debate in relation to drug policy reform in the UK. The other surprising, unexpected and unusual partnership has been with the church. So we're now involved in rolling this out from festivals to city centres, and we've been looking at different types of spaces. And the idea is that if we have city centre testing, it can be potentially more inclusive, it can have a wider reach, therefore wider impact, and potentially can address and encourage any drug using communities to use the service and be proactive. So people are testing ahead of a festival. We don't need to wait for the festival to put out any alerts. We can do it ahead of time. And also you can then embed any particular concerns or referrals into the existing infrastructure in health, in social services and so on. And also bearing in mind what I just said about intoxication at festivals, you can be capturing people and having these healthcare interventions where they are hopefully more straight and more sober than might be the case at a festival. But what we have found, though, is that there has been reluctance to enter drug services for this testing. So we've tried out Youth and Community Centre, drug service, and what we found was the most popular venue for city centre testing was a church. I think there was something still about it being a neutral space, a sanctuary. There's an idea that the police won't hide behind a curtain and come out and arrest people. And it's large enough that we can have a mobile lab in there. It's central. People can go and have a coffee. If they're going to wait an hour for the test result, go shopping, something like that. But we've also found it's been really good in terms of engaging opiate using and rough sleeper communities, because some of these groups already have an existing relationship with the church themselves, and we've been able to hook into that and piggyback off that. These are groups who might already come in and use cafes, the toilet facilities, things like that. So we were testing in Durham City Centre, and we had opiate using rough sleepers come in and use our service because of that relationship with the church. So we do need to think, though, about venue, about location, and about stigma entering services. We had party drug users saying they wouldn't go into existing drug services because they didn't want to be seen potentially by family and friends or their employer walking past and seeing them go to use that testing service. So we have to think about those sorts of issues in terms of how we design, what are the design features, the operational features for city centre testing. In terms of the productive partnership, then that would be the whole multi-agency partnership, really, that we developed it and designed it to be a multi-agency partnership, working with the local police, and obviously me being a criminologist, that helped because I was already working with them. But also the fact that it was this slow incremental change, and that we piggybacked off existing local partnerships. There were already people who were working together as in festivals and in nightclubs, and we were able to work together with those existing productive partnerships. And also particular individuals. The photo in the middle shows some of the key individuals who were willing to support this. The festival promoter, the guy with the red tie, who was the gold commander at the first festival that ever agreed to drug check in the UK, and also the person on the right-hand side, Freddie Fellows, who owns Secret Garden Party, which is the very first festival that we delivered at. He owns the land. He's the landowner. And so there are interesting issues there about the dynamics of private property versus public property. It's been much easier to accelerate this on private land than on public land. Also, these people are bright, willing to listen to the evidence, willing to hear about what's happening in Europe, and to think about the potential for this in terms of evidence-based policy within their commercial venue. We also decided to set the bar high, and I think that helped in terms of the multi-agency partnerships. The aim was that these were professionals. We didn't talk about our volunteers as peers. We don't ask for disclosure from our peers. We don't ask what their motivation is. I'm sure some would call themselves peers. So we're in a grey area, like Magdalena said, about between peer and professional as well, I think. We also think about giving back. So we do a lot of training on site of the people involved in the agencies and partnerships. And also that's true of the volunteers. There's an idea there's upskilling and a professional development. Amongst 35 chemists, there's lots of opportunities to be training each other, but also in terms of training on site as well. So how do we measure success? I'll briefly say something about this, the micro and the macro. So at the micro level, we've been looking at what are the behavioural outcomes in terms of individuals. We ask people about their medical history, their drug using history, current drug use, medications, looking at polydrug synergies and so on. What we found is about 9 in 10 people who use our service have never spoken to a healthcare professional about their drug use before. So these are hidden populations in the fact that they are hidden from drug services by and large. And 2 in 5 of the people who use our service say that after they've heard about the strength of the substance and about dosage, will moderate their dose afterwards. Getting back to Adam's point about the importance of moderation, particularly with high-strength drugs at the moment. 1 in 5 actually throw away the substance. They don't want to take it once they find out what's in it. It's not what they wanted, and we provide a disposal service for that. And 1 in 20 ask for onward referral to a drug service. So they want to carry on these conversations about their own health. Significantly, we find the people who use the service and the people who dispose of substances are more likely to be younger, newer initiatives, and more likely to be female as well. There's a question there that we've not answered yet, which is why is it that older men are less likely to use drug checking services? It could be that they think they have more reliable sources in terms of their dealers and they don't think they need to use the service, or maybe they think they already know the harm reduction messages. But we're definitely seeing age and gender issues here. The meso level is more difficult though in terms of how we progress evaluations there. We can look at things like early presentations and increased confidence of medics to treat on site. So you reduce hospital admissions and that reduces the burden down the line to the NHS. We found that there was a 95% reduction in hospital admissions from Secret Garden Party the first year we introduced it, 25% reduction in medical incidents at Boomtown the first year we introduced it, and the Red Cross did an independent survey at Love Saves the Day Festival that there was a 12% decrease in medical incidents. So there's various sort of soft data coming out. And we think that by these alerts, by this information for emergency services, that we can spread this information about what's in circulation. But there are some concerns. First of all, in terms of meso level evaluation, it's really, really difficult to get the data in relation to alcohol and drug related. Often it's all conflated. So to find out if we're making a difference or not, it's very difficult to even get the data from the different agencies on site. They have better things to do. They're dealing with the emergencies than to collect data for us. We've also found, though, going back to my point about commercial interests, festivals now want to put out alerts to be seen to be doing things to cover their back. And so we're not making these decisions in a vacuum about what we warn about. We're also responding to the pressures from these commercial situations. So finally, say something about the wider partnerships then. We're not only telling service users, the individuals, what's in the substance, we're informing all emergency services on site, whether that be festival or city centre. We also feed into local and regional drug services, into regional early warning systems. We also put out alerts on our social media, and that feeds into general media coverage. We're a member of a European drug checking network, and a subgroup of that, and we're starting to pull our data at European level, so we know far more about international trends. And also globally, drug checking services, we share reference standards. We're constantly in discussion with each other about the latest trends, the latest substances. If somebody hasn't worked out what something is, they can't identify it, then everyone else steps in to help. So there's a very strong and supportive global drug checking community. And finally, that's also feeding now into academic papers. So in terms of on-site then, we've got information about very, very localised, real-time alerts about local drug markets, but also off-site now, in terms of monitoring and evaluating the off-site feedback. Our alerts are now reaching over 500,000 people in the UK. So we can say, we can get those messages out if something is a particular concern. What we need to be looking at now, though, is what the impact of those messages are. We've got a PhD student who's looking at risk communication and drug messaging now. I started off at the beginning saying that in a way this was a bottom-up approach from grassroots community action. It's now steadily moving up, so we've had support from public health, we've got support from regional police, and probably the biggest national policy recognition to date was in a recent select committee report which said that they supported on-site drug checking. So we have moved from the bottom up at a glacial pace. But finally, just to say, it's not really about testing in a way, and to go back to some of the other themes, it's about informing and empowering individuals, treating individual drug users as agents of change, and also prioritising their health and human rights above criminal justice, and recognising the pharmacological pleasures that they might have, as well as the debate around cognitive liberty. And also potentially for me, one of the things that's been quite extraordinary is building bridges between stakeholders who don't normally work together, and there might be tensions between police, local authority, public health, commercial interests of festivals or licensed venues. Getting everybody around a table prioritising harm reduction has been a very positive experience. But also I'm thinking that we have to break out of this catch-22 of when is there enough evidence to say that we can try to introduce a new policy. And I really like this phrase by Tim Rhodes and Kylie Lancaster in Australia about an evidence-making intervention. And so I would characterise it as that. We cannot always be waiting for the perfect opportunity with a randomised controlled trial. We can be having those evidence-making interventions. And also the other thing is to be thinking about that testing can operate in a wide variety of policy contexts as well. We don't have to think about this just in relation to one drug policy context. We will always need to be quality assuring anything, regardless of its legal status, whether it's regulated or unregulated. It creates, though, pockets of tolerance a tolerance zone of amnesty. Potentially you could see that of de facto decriminalisation. And I think potentially that then could be a stepping stone to drug policy reform. But while we wait for that, because that could be quite a long wait, the final point for all of us, I think, is that in the meantime, in the here and now, we've got this record drug-related death rate, and that's something that I think motivates all of us here to be addressing that. And I think that drug checking can be a part of that story. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. That was a very good and interesting presentation. We've got time for maybe one or two quick questions before we go to the final workshops.
Thanks, Fiona. That was wonderful. I know there have been some attempts to introduce the drug checking in Scotland at some of the festivals, so I wonder if you could give us an update on how that is going and what barriers there may be to it.
As far as I know, I mean, I've only been really involved in some of those debates, but as far as I know, that I thought there was a lot of support at local level and at regional level, but there was some obstruction at the very highest level. So that was how I understood the debate going. Yeah, I'm afraid I don't know any more than that.
Well, thank you, Fiona.
Okay, thank you.
Brilliant.